Hi, my name is Rick Bloodworth. This is the Common Sense Christian channel, and today I want to talk to you about the legacy that you're leaving behind for your family, for your kids, for your descendants. I want to start off with a comment that my wife heard another of her friends make about this recent Christmas. Her family came into town. They have several daughters, and the mama was talking about how gratifying it was to her to see the husbands helping with different things. They've got several grandchildren now, and the husbands were doing their part with the kids and with other things. And so she was really gratified about that. But the thing that really pleased her was the fact that her daughters were getting along so well. She said it just gave her a lot of joy to watch her daughters interact and enjoy one another. Well, why is that? And why was that what was the prominent thought in her mind? Her kids are doing well. They're doing well financially. They have good jobs. They're in good health. But it was the relationships that she was talking about. It was the way that they interacted with each other, helped each other. Well, that's a legacy. But again, why? And the reason I believe is because they're Christians. And this is the way they were raised, and this is the way that they are in fact treating one another. They didn't just take their raising, they just didn't take their instruction and discard it as something that was nice from an era gone by. They've actually applied it to their lives, maybe without thinking specifically about having done so, but the fruits of that are very evident. And so, this lady was talking about how wonderful it was to see her family in this condition. Well, I want to talk about this type of a legacy. I believe this is a type of a legacy that Christians leave for one another. Obviously, the most important is that we be servants of Christ, and that someday we be with God and Christ forever, for all eternity, serving them, continuing that service. I want to go to a couple of examples from the Old Testament that I think really will help to set this lesson. At least it has helped to set this lesson in my mind. And the first place I want to go is Jeremiah chapter 35. This is towards the tail end of Israel's prominence. As a matter of fact, they're on the way out. They're about to be destroyed. They've been a mighty nation before God for many hundreds of years. But they have gone away from God. And because of that, they ended up actually splitting as a nation, having hundreds of years of civil wars and wars with other nations around them. They were warned time and time again that if they didn't follow God's commandments, and if they didn't pass these commands down to their children, that there'd be a punishment to pay. And they'd been suffering this punishment for quite some time. We're getting to the tail end of that. Babylon is about to come in and absolutely destroy Jerusalem. But before he does, God sends the Israelites who live in Jerusalem, specifically the nation of Judah now, a warning from the prophet Jeremiah. And this is how he set up that warning. In Jeremiah chapter 35, starting in verse 1, this is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord during the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah. Go to the Rechabite family and invite them to one of the side rooms of the house of the Lord and give them wine to drink. And Jeremiah says in verse 3, so I went. And then in verse 4 it says, I brought them into the house of the Lord. And picking up again in verse 5, then I set bowls full of wine and some cups before the men of the Rechabite family, and I said to them, drink some wine. But they replied, we do not drink wine, because our forefather, Jonadab, son of Rechab, gave us this command, neither you nor your descendants must never drink wine. And they also had some other requirements. It said also you must never build houses, sow seed, or plant vineyards. You must never do any of these things, but must always live in tents. And so the family of the Rechabites were following the instructions of their forefathers, Jonadab. And because of that, they were blessed. They enjoyed peace within the family. But this was just a man-made set of rules. They were good rules, don't get me wrong, but they were nothing compared to the commandments of God. And the illustration that God is going to make, the comparison that God is about to make, is the idea that the Rechabites were honoring their father, just a physical man, and their grandfather, just a physical man. But Israel, his chosen people, were not following the commandments of the Lord Most High. And so here we're going to pick up now in verse 12 of Jeremiah 35. And it starts this way. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, saying, This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says, Go and tell the men of Judah and the people of Jerusalem, Will you not learn a lesson and obey my words? Declares the Lord, Jonadab, son of Rechab, ordered his sons not to drink wine, and this command has been kept. To this day they do not drink wine because they obey their forefathers' command. But I have spoken to you again and again, yet you have not obeyed me. And because of that, God goes on to tell them of the penalty for their disobedience. But this question that God asks the men of Judah, the women of Judah, will you not learn the lesson? That's a great question for us today. I believe most of us who have had good parents and who are trying to be decent ourselves have followed the wishes of our parents. And sometimes our parents have set certain standards that we've tried to abide with. Even though they might just be human standards, we can see the basic value in it. And so we do that. But do we obey God's standards? When we do, we have some pretty wonderful things occur, like that situation of this Christian man and this Christian woman's family as their daughters and sons-in-law gathered together, and they got to enjoy the peace that comes from a family that has Christian virtues, that helps one another, and that sincerely enjoys one another and enjoys being together. Well, we can learn something from that. The question, I think, for you and I is, what kind of a legacy do we want to leave to our family? Will we set for them godly standards? Will we pass along to them God's commandments? And will we insist to them when they are young and encourage them when they are older to abide by these commandments? Because if we'll do that ourselves, and if we will encourage our children and our grandchildren and for them to raise their families in the same way, well, that's a legacy worth leaving behind. That's a legacy that will go unto eternity and will last throughout eternity. But so many people aren't focused on that. A lot of times when I talk to different parents, they're very proud of how their children are doing financially. Nothing wrong with that. I think that God blesses us if we abide by certain prudent principles in life. But if that's the main focus, or if that's the only focus, how well they're doing financially, or if all we are concerned about is how healthy we are, and that's an important consideration, isn't it? I'm not knocking that one bit. But if these are the main things, if we're leaving a legacy of health and wealth, but not of spiritual health and wealth, well, we're leaving a legacy that won't last for very long. And after a while, if they do not have the Christian principles, well, their legacy is going to fall apart in the other areas as well. We've all seen families who have seemed to have had everything, and yet here they are in misery. Maybe they've got some kind of a substance abuse. Maybe they've had tremendous personal relationship problems. Maybe they struggle in different areas of their life. What kind of a legacy will we leave behind? Will it be something that is for God and therefore our family will be blessed because of that, even though it's kind of hard to do? Or will we leave a legacy that's just merely physical behind? Now, when God used the family of Rechab to be an illustration, he used them not just because they were following their grandfather's desires and their father's desires. He used them as an illustration because they were righteous people. And they were doing both. They were honoring God and their father. In that order, I might add. Will we learn that lesson? What kind of legacy are you leaving behind? You see, Israel, because they refused to come into compliance with God's commandments, and because they had not been raised with a godly legacy, though they should have been. They had a godly heritage. But at some point they rejected it. Their fathers rejected it. And because of that, now they're about to go into captivity. And when they went into captivity, I also want to add that it was just about 1% of the original nation that was once mighty. A mighty nation that had maybe 3 or 4 million people, or maybe much more than that, was only going to have a little over 3,000 people go into captivity. That's not a very good ratio, is it? Matter of fact, that's not 1%, that's 0.1%. Now, there were some that were left behind in the land, but many of these sinned and tried to go into Egypt and were wiped out there. And there was a remnant left over from Israel. That was the other side of the kingdom that had split hundreds of years earlier. And they intermingled with the nations around them when the Assyrian Empire carried them off into captivity. And they mingled with them and they became the Samaritans. But of those who were the remnant, of those who went into Babylon to try and rebuild, and who 70 years later would come back and rebuild the nation of Israel, well, they were going to be the ones that were going to start a new legacy. And again, they were starting at a much reduced number than where they had been, about 0.1%. They had started with a legacy of God, being God's chosen people, and they ended up in a legacy of shame. But the remnant that remained, well, they started to build back that godly legacy again. Hundreds of years before this happened, there was a champion by the name of Joshua. You remember Joshua. It was Joshua and Caleb who were the two spies who went into Canaan when Moses sent them in to spy out the land. They were the two that gave the good report. It is a big land. The people are mighty, but we can take it because God is with us. But the people rejected that. Joshua and Caleb survived. Most of the people did not. At the end of Joshua's life, we read this. It's found in Joshua chapter 24, and it's one of the greatest legacy building challenges that's found in the Bible. And this is what he says in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15. Just before he dies, he says this, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." That is a legacy worth leaving behind. And for those who took up that legacy, who lived by that legacy to serve the Lord, well, they did well. But the vast majority of them did not. And so the small percentage enjoyed a legacy of blessings. The rest of them suffered with a legacy of shame and all the consequences that come when we leave God's way. What kind of legacy are you leaving for your family? What kind of service are you doing for God right now? What kind of an example are you leaving for them? Are you just telling them to be good, but you're not trying to be? Or are you walking the walk as you talk the talk? What kind of a legacy will we leave for our family? Will it be one of servitude to God and yet tremendous honor because God will bless us? Or will it be a legacy of shame because we have focused merely on the physical things? It's a question we all need to answer. But I would encourage you to join Joshua, and I am determined to do the same, to say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now that's a legacy worth leaving behind. Something to think about, isn't it? I appreciate your watching today. I appreciate the time you've taken to do so. I appreciate those of you who have subscribed to the channel. I'm going to try and start getting more videos up. I've been through a very busy period in my life, but I'm going to try and start doing regular videos and regular articles on the CommonSenseChristian.com channel. But anyway, I do appreciate your watching today. Let me know what you think in the comments. And I hope we'll see you again next time. And I pray that God will richly bless you as you seek to serve Him and leave behind a godly legacy for your family and for God, because God is worthy of such a legacy. God bless.